February 1945. The Pacific War was entering its cruelest stage. For years, Japanese soldiers had been told that capture by the Americans meant certain death, that those who surrendered would be starved, beaten, and humiliated until they begged for mercy that would never come. To be taken alive was the ultimate disgrace, a betrayal of the emperor himself. So when Sergeant Kenji Takahashi opened his eyes inside a white canvas tent, hearing the faint sound of music and laughter somewhere in the distance, his mind refused to accept that he was still alive. He lay still, weak and disoriented, the heavy scent of antiseptic in the air. His last memory was of the battlefield, the deafening roar of artillery, the smoke, the searing pain as shrapnel tore through his shoulder. Everything after that had been darkness. Now there was sunlight pressing gently through the tent walls, and the strange rhythmic sound of men moving calmly outside. There was no shouting, no gunfire, no cruelty, only the soft hum of normal life, something he hadn't felt in years. When he gathered the strength to step outside, the sight that met him shattered every belief he had carried through the war. The camp stretched out across a field of green earth, surrounded by fences but peaceful. Wooden barracks stood in perfect order, their walls painted and roofs clean. Men in neat uniforms moved about without haste or fear. The air carried the scent of bread, coffee, and soil freshly turned by hands working in gardens. He saw Japanese prisoners tending small vegetable plots, their faces calm, their movements slow but purposeful. The place was quiet, almost unnaturally so, a placket of humanity preserved amid the madness of war. He noticed that the American guards did not carry themselves with cruelty. They walked their patrols with rifles slung casually at their sides, not raised in threat. Their posture was that of men maintaining order, not enforcing domination. Even the barbed wire seemed less like a symbol of imprisonment and more like a fragile reminder that this was still war, even if it no longer felt like it. For a long time Kenji stood motionless, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he had been taught. In his mind, American prison camps were places of starvation and torment. Yet here the prisoners were fed, clothed, and treated with a level of decency that defied all reason. The enemy he had imagined, monstrous, merciless, soulless, appeared to be something else entirely. That evening, as dusk settled over the camp, the prisoners were told to gather in a large wooden hall near the center. Many hesitated, unsure of what awaited them. The building was large but simple, its walls decorated with hand-drawn posters and flags from different nations. Rows of wooden benches faced a blank white wall at the far end. As the men took their seats, the lights dimmed, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then a faint mechanical sound began to echo, a whirring, steady rhythm that grew louder, followed by a sudden burst of light. A beam cut through the darkness and moving images appeared on the wall. The men froze. Before them unfolded scenes of laughter, families and towns far removed from war. It was a film, a motion picture, something none of them had imagined would exist inside a prison camp. For Japanese soldiers who had spent years in the jungle, surrounded by death and fear, the moving light felt like a vision from another world. The faces on the screen were foreign, yet their emotions were not. The characters smiled, cried, and embraced with a warmth that transcended language. The flickering images illuminated the prisoners' faces, revealing eyes filled with disbelief, wonder, and quiet sorrow. Many had not seen a film since before the war began. For some, it was the first time they had ever seen one at all. As the story on screen unfolded, a tale of ordinary people, of love, struggle, and forgiveness, the prisoners sat completely still, their thoughts drifting between past and present. The flicker of light reminded them of lives they had left behind, of streets and families that once existed before duty and obedience consumed them. The sound of laughter and music mixed with the faint rustle of uniforms and the distant hum of the generator. In that moment, the war outside seemed to fade away, leaving only a fragile shared humanity suspended in the air. When the film ended, there was no applause, only silence, a deep, trembling silence filled with the weight of realization. Many of the prisoners had expected to die in humiliation. Instead, they had been shown a glimpse of life as their captors knew it. The shock was not in the comfort of food or shelter, but in the kindness of small things, a seat in a hall, the glow of a projector, the choice to offer beauty instead of brutality. The night as the camp lights dimmed, Kenji lay awake on his narrow bed staring at the ceiling. The faint echo of the film's soundtrack still lingered in his mind. It was not the film itself that haunted him, but what it represented, a truth he could not escape. He had been raised to believe the Americans were monsters. Yet in their hands he had found something he could not name. It was not pity. It was not arrogance. It was something gentler, deeper, a quiet respect for life, even that of an enemy. Outside, the night wind rustled through the fences, and the world seemed impossibly vast beyond the boundaries of the camp. For the first time since the war began, he felt a strange, unfamiliar ache, not of fear or anger but of humility. It was the beginning of a realization that would grow stronger with each passing day. A question that would gnaw at his heart long after the war was over. Morning came softly over the camp, carrying with it a light mist that clung to the fences and turned the world pale silver. The air was cool, the ground damp, and the silence heavy with unspoken questions. For the Japanese prisoners, each new day began not with orders or punishment, but with the distant ring of a bell and the smell of bread drifting from the mass hall. It was an orderliness that confused them, a rhythm too gentle for war. What they had expected to be a nightmare had revealed itself as something strangely human, a place where discipline existed without cruelty, and where life, though confined, still moved forward. Sergeant Kenji Takahashi often stood near the edge of the compound, watching the guards walk their rounds. They did not shout or threaten. They observed quietly, as if aware that peace depended not on fear but on structure. The prisoners moved with silent cooperation, performing assigned tasks, cleaning, building, gardening, not because they were forced to, but because the routine itself gave them meaning. After years of chaos, there was an unfamiliar comfort and predictability. The monotony once feared became a form of healing. Days began to blur into one another. The sound of footsteps on gravel replaced the echo of gunfire in their memories. The clang of trays in the dining hall became the new drumbeat of survival. In the afternoons, the prisoners were encouraged to read, to study, to draw, or simply to rest. The Americans had built a small library inside one of the barracks, stocked with books and magazines that had crossed oceans and wars. Most of the words were foreign, but the images spoke their own language: smiling faces, wide streets, cities untouched by bombs. To men who had been told that America was a land of savages, the photographs felt like glimpses of another universe. The days stretched into weeks, and with each passing sunrise, the fear that had once gripped their hearts began to loosen. The prisoners noticed things they had never been allowed to see in the army: the way light moved across a wall, the quiet dignity of a man tending plants, the peace that came from sitting under an open sky with nothing but the sound of birds. Some began to hum old songs from home, their voices faint but sincere. Others wrote in notebooks given to them by the guards, filling the pages with sketches, memories, and questions that had no answers. The camp had its rhythms: work in the mornings, meals in the afternoon, and moments of reflection in the evenings. But as days passed, something else began to happen. The prisoners started to look at their captors not as faceless enemies, but as human beings. The realization was slow and unsettling. It came not from words, but from gestures: a guard sharing a cigarette through the wire, a warm meal served without disdain, a wound treated with care rather than contempt. Each act chipped away at the image of the American monster that wartime propaganda had built within them. One of the greatest shocks came with the discovery of recreation. There were fields marked for baseball, an activity that had once been introduced to Japan by Americans decades earlier. At first, the prisoners stood apart, watching from a distance as the guards played. But over time, curiosity replaced hesitation. The game that had once symbolized the foreign became a bridge between worlds. The sight of men running across the field, shouting and laughing, blurred the invisible lines of enemy and ally. For the first time, the camp echoed not with the language of command, but with the language of joy. Evenings often brought with them the hum of the generator near the recreation hall. When its deep mechanical rhythm began, the men knew what awaited them. The projector would flicker to life, casting its beam of light across the hall once more. The same prisoners who had once been hardened soldiers now sat shoulder to shoulder. Their eyes fixed on the white wall where stories unfolded, tales of distant towns, of families waiting, of lives interrupted and renewed. Each film became a silent lesson in humanity. The laughter of strangers, the courage of ordinary people, and the compassion woven into those moving images spoke more powerfully than any lecture could. In those darkened rooms, surrounded by men who had once lived only for battle, something remarkable began to take root: empathy. The light from the projector fell across faces scarred by war, softening them, illuminating eyes that had long been dimmed by duty. They began to understand that the enemy was not what they had been told, and that the real tragedy of war was not defeat or death, but the loss of understanding between men who were not so different after all. As the weeks drifted by, Kenji felt an unfamiliar peace settling within him. He began to sleep more soundly. The nightmares that had once haunted him, the explosions, the cries of the wounded, the endless commands shouted into chaos, began to fade. In their place came new images: the quiet hum of the projector, the rustle of pages turning in the library, the sound of rain falling on the tin roofs of the barracks. The simplicity of these moments carried more power than the ideology he had once fought for. The seasons began to change, and with them so did the men. Their uniforms grew worn, their faces thinner but their eyes softer. Some began to teach each other a few English words, a few fragments of poetry, small gifts exchanged in silence. The camp had become more than a place of confinement. It had become a fragile world where humanity had been rediscovered in captivity. At night, Kenji would lie awake listening to the faint wind outside. Beyond the fences, the war still raged and countless men still died in its name. But within those boundaries, he had found something the battlefield had never offered: the quiet dignity of being treated as a man, not a machine of war. In the stillness of those nights, he often thought of the first movie he had seen in the camp: the light, the faces, the laughter. He realized that the Americans had not shown them those films merely for entertainment. They were showing them what life looked like without hate. They were showing them a reflection of humanity that could exist beyond conflict. And in that realization, a deep, painful truth began to unfold within him: that compassion, not power, was the true victory of civilization. As the last lights of the camp went out, the darkness felt less like a prison and more like a place of reflection. For the first time, the boundaries of barbed wire did not represent despair. They represented a strange kind of safety, a pause in a world that had forgotten how to be gentle. And beneath that vast American sky, in a camp built for enemies, men who once swore never to surrender were beginning to understand that surrendering to humanity was not weakness. It was the first step toward peace. By the time spring settled over the American countryside, the prison camp had become something no one on either side could have imagined. The fences still stood, the guards still marched, and the war outside still tore the world apart. Yet within those quiet boundaries, a strange peace had taken root. The rhythm of captivity had softened into something that resembled life. The men no longer walked with their shoulders hunched in fear. They moved with calm, measured purpose, each step carrying a faint sense of belonging to something beyond war. The camp awoke each morning to the same sounds: the bell's hollow ring, the distant call from the kitchens, the clatter of trays and utensils echoing through the crisp air. But now those sounds no longer reminded them of control. They reminded them of stability. Even in captivity, order had begun to feel like freedom. What once symbolized defeat was slowly becoming a place of quiet rebirth. The days unfolded with deliberate simplicity. Some prisoners worked in the gardens, turning the soil, planting seeds, watching green sprouts rise through the earth. Others took to reading, their fingers tracing foreign words that carried meanings they could only partially grasp. Yet they kept reading anyway, as though searching for understanding itself. The guards noticed the change too. The anger that had once lived in the prisoners' eyes was fading. replaced by curiosity, reflection, and a hunger for something that went deeper than food. Then came the day the camp commander announced that letters could now be sent home. The news moved through the camp like wind across dry grass, igniting emotions that had long been buried beneath silence. For men who had been told they might never see home again, the idea of communicating with their families felt impossible, almost dangerous in its tenderness. Many of them had left Japan years before, convinced that they would die in battle, their names forever lost to the sea or jungle. Now, the thought of their words crossing the ocean to reach their mothers, wives or children seemed to awaken something ancient. The simple need to be remembered. Sheets of paper were distributed carefully, each one precious, each one holding the weight of a man's entire heart. The prisoners sat at wooden tables, pens trembling in their hands. The first words were hesitant, clumsy, uncertain. They wrote of their health, of the food, of the strange kindness of the Americans, though many could not bring themselves to admit how deeply it had affected them. For some it was too difficult to describe what it meant to be treated as a human being by the very people they had been trained to despise. The act of writing itself became a quiet form of redemption, a way to bridge the impossible distance between past hatred and present understanding. In the weeks that followed, the camp was filled with a new kind of energy. The mailroom became the most sacred place within the fences. Men gathered in long lines, waiting with patience and trembling anticipation for their names to be called. When letters arrived, they were read slowly, reverently, over and over again. Many wept quietly, holding the fragile papers close to their chests, as if they were holding a piece of home itself. For others, no letters came. Yet even that silence felt softer, in the shared company of those who understood the ache of distance. The presence of letters transformed the camp in ways no one could have predicted. The men began to talk more openly among themselves. They spoke of their families, their childhoods, the rivers and mountains of home. Memories once too painful to recall became the very things that kept them alive. In writing to the living, they had begun to reclaim their own humanity. The seasons continued to change, painting the camp in shifting tones of gold and green. The gardens bloomed with vegetables and flowers planted by hands that had once carried weapons. The library grew larger, filled with donated books and translated materials. Education became an escape, but also a quiet rebellion against ignorance. In learning the language of their captors, the prisoners discovered that understanding was its own form of freedom. Evenings often brought back the flicker of the movie projector, a ritual that had become the heartbeat of the camp. Each screening was a reminder that life outside the fences still existed, that laughter and art and compassion continued despite the war. For men who had known nothing but destruction, those images of ordinary life were more powerful than any sermon. The moving light on the wall was not entertainment. It was hope made visible. As the months passed, the prisoners began to notice something profound. The way their perception of the Americans had changed. The hatred that had once seemed so natural now felt distant, almost foreign. The men who guarded them were no longer symbols of power, but individuals with faces, gestures, and kindnesses that defied propaganda. In quiet observation, they saw the Americans working long hours, writing letters of their own, laughing at simple jokes, and mourning their fallen comrades. Humanity, stripped of uniform and ideology, looked the same on both sides. Kenji often thought of this as he watched the sunset from his bunk. The sky above the camp burned in shades of red and gold, the same colors that once blazed behind his village in Japan. He realized that no matter where men were born, they all sought the same small things: warmth, food, dignity, and the chance to be understood. War had disguised those truths beneath layers of pride and obedience, but captivity had stripped them bare again. Over time, the emotional distance between captor and captive became thinner than anyone would admit aloud. The guards began to treat the prisoners with familiarity, trusting them with tools, books, even musical instruments. Some of the Japanese men began to play harmonicas or makeshift flutes fashioned from scraps of wood and metal. The sound of music drifting across the yard was haunting. yet peaceful, a reminder that even within fences beauty could exist. For the first time, many of the prisoners began to question not only the war, but the beliefs that had shaped their lives before it. They thought of the teachers and officers who had told them that mercy was weakness, that compassion was betrayal, that dying for honor was the only path. Yet here, inside an American prison, they had found more honor and kindness than they ever had in bloodshed. The discovery was painful, like waking from a long fever. It stripped them of pride but filled them with something far more enduring: humility. They began to understand that survival was not merely a physical act, but a moral one. To live, to see goodness where they had been taught to see only evil, was itself a form of resistance against the lies of war. As the letters continued to flow between continents, the camp no longer felt like a place of punishment. It became a fragile sanctuary, suspended between two worlds, the one they had lost, and the one they were slowly learning to believe in. Each man carried within him the faint glow of realization that even in defeat, there could be redemption. And when the night came, when the lights of the camp flickered off and the silence of the American plains swallowed every sound, many of them lay awake beneath the soft hum of the wind, no longer haunted by the ghosts of battle. They did not dream of victory anymore. They dreamed of peace not as an idea, but as a life that could exist in the simplest acts of humanity. In the end, it was not the fences that kept them there. It was the understanding that something profound had changed within them, that captivity, instead of breaking them, had quietly rebuilt them into men who finally knew the meaning of compassion. The summer of 1945 came quietly to the prison camp. Though the world outside was anything but quiet, the air had grown heavy with rumors, carried by guards who spoke in low voices in newspapers that arrived with trembling headlines. The Japanese prisoners could not read every word, but they could feel it. Something immense was changing, something that would alter not only the course of the war, but the meaning of their very existence. Days stretched under the unforgiving sun. The men worked in silence, their hands moving mechanically but their minds restless. Whispers of bombings, of cities erased in moments, of a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. They spread through the camp like invisible fire. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, words that felt too unreal to belong to the world they knew. Some men refused to believe them. Others stared at the sky as if searching for answers written in the clouds. Then one morning the sound of the camp bell came later than usual. The guards moved differently that day, slower, heavier, as though burdened by something far greater than duty. When the announcement came, it was not shouted, not celebrated, but spoken with a quiet solemnity that carried through the air like a final echo. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. For a long moment no one moved. The world itself seemed to stop. The prisoners stood in stunned stillness, their faces pale with disbelief. The empire they had sworn their lives to, the flag they had once saluted with unshakable devotion, had fallen. The dream of victory, the idea that death in battle was the ultimate honor, it was gone. In its place was silence, vast and unbearable. Many sank to the ground, their minds unable to grasp the weight of what had been lost. Some wept openly for the first time, not out of sorrow for defeat, but for the collapse of everything they had believed in. Their country had surrendered. Their families were scattered. And the war that had consumed their youth had ended without glory, without purpose. It was as if the very meaning of their existence had dissolved into the dust beneath their feet. The Americans did not cheer. There was no triumph in their faces. They too had lost friends, brothers, and sons to the same unforgiving war. In that strange moment, the camp became a place of shared grief rather than victory. The guards looked at the prisoners not as enemies, but as men caught in the same tide of tragedy. The fences that had once divided them seemed smaller, almost irrelevant. As the days passed, preparations began for repatriation. The prisoners would be returned to Japan, to a homeland many no longer recognized, to a nation scarred by fire and surrender. The realization filled the camp with a haunting quiet. For years, the prisoners had longed for freedom, yet now, as it approached, they felt a strange sense of fear. The camp had become their strange refuge, a place where they had rediscovered the fragments of their humanity. What awaited them beyond the fences was unknown. Each man packed his few belongings carefully: a letter, a book, a photograph, a memory. The American officers provided them with clean clothes and food for the journey. Some of the guards, hardened by years of duty, offered small gestures of kindness that spoke louder than any words could. A shared look, a nod of respect, a brief silence between two men who understood what the other had endured. Before their departure, one final movie was shown in the camp theater, a simple American film about family, loss, and starting over. As the flickering images danced on the screen, the men sat together in the dark, their faces illuminated by light that seemed softer than ever before. They watched in silence, knowing it would be the last time they would gather in that place. The story on the screen was not about war or victory, but about life itself, the kind that continued despite pain, despite endings. When the projector finally stopped, no one moved for several minutes. The silence that followed felt sacred, as if the camp itself were holding its breath. The men knew that they would never forget this place: the wooden benches, the hum of the machine, the faint smell of oil and dust. It had been their window to a world beyond hate, a world that had somehow taught them to see humanity again. The next morning, they were led out in small groups toward the waiting trucks that would take them to the port. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. The wind carried the scent of the sea, the same sea that would take them home. They looked back one last time at the camp, the barracks, the gardens, the theater, the towers, and realized that the place they had once feared had become the one they would never forget. As the trucks rolled away, the camp grew smaller in the distance, until it disappeared entirely. Yet it remained etched in their memories, not as a prison, but as the place where their souls had quietly begun to heal. When they finally reached Japan, what awaited them was devastation. Entire cities reduced to ashes, streets filled with silence, faces they could no longer recognize. But amid the ruins, they carried something no bomb could destroy: the lessons learned within those American fences. They had witnessed mercy in the face of victory, compassion in the shadow of war. They had learned that strength was not in domination, but in understanding. Years later, many would speak of that time with a quiet reverence. They would tell their children not of the battles they fought, but of the kindness they saw in the unlikeliest of places. They would remember the movie theater in the middle of captivity, the letters that crossed oceans, and the realization that even in defeat, there could be dignity. For them, the true surrender had not been Japan's, had been their surrender to humanity. The moment they chose to see beyond the uniforms, beyond the flags, beyond the hatred that had blinded them for so long. And that surrender, unlike the one signed on paper, would endure forever.